Welcome back to another quiet journey through the forgotten corners of history. Tonight, we're stepping into the shadows, not the dramatic, torchlit shadows of legend, but the quieter, more persistent shadows where certain people live their entire lives. The margins of society, where necessity created the strangest professions, and where desperation met superstition in the most unexpected ways. Before we settle in for this exploration, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here together. And if you feel like it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all scattered across the world, yet sharing these same quiet moments with the past. Now, dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let yourself drift back to a time when the line between the living and the dead was both thinner and more carefully guarded than we might imagine today. Tonight, we'll meet the Sin Eater, a figure so laden with other spiritual burdens that he could barely carry his own. We'll walk the narrow, refuse-filled streets with the Gong farmer, whose work was literally the foundation upon which civilized life rested. We'll witness the grim entrepreneurship of Burke and Hare, two men who turned the natural cycle of death into something far more sinister. And we'll crouch beside the mudlarks on the Thames foreshore, children whose very survival depended on what others had lost or discarded. These are stories of people who lived in the spaces between life and death, between cleanliness and filth, between respectability and absolute social exile. Their work was essential, their presence barely tolerated, and their humanity often forgotten entirely. So breathe slowly, let your shoulders drop, and prepare to enter a world where the most necessary work was often the most reviled, and where the people who kept society functioning were the very ones society refused to acknowledge. Verse 1. The world of the Sin Eater. Picture, if you will, a cottage at the very edge of a village. Not the picturesque edge where prosperous farmers might build their homes with views of rolling fields, but the other edge, the boundary where the village peters out into scrubland, where the road becomes little more than a worn path, and where the last house sits like an afterthought, almost apologetic for existing at all. This is where you might find a Sin Eater in 17th century Britain, in a dwelling that occupies the liminal space between community and wilderness, between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. The cottage itself tells a story of careful distance close enough to the village that a messenger could reach it when needed, far enough that its occupant wouldn't accidentally contaminate daily life with his presence. The building is modest, even by the standards of its time. Stone walls perhaps, if stone is plentiful in the region, but more likely timber and daub, with a thatched roof that's always a season or two behind in repairs. There are no neighbors dropping by with fresh bread or village gossip. The vegetable garden, if there is one, grows things that can largely tend themselves: onions, leeks, perhaps some hardy cabbages. This is not a life that allows for the luxury of delicate herbs or flowers that require daily attention. The Sin Eater's days are marked not by the rhythms of ordinary village life, the church bells, the market days, the seasonal festivals, but by something altogether more somber. His calendar is written in other people's mortality. To understand the Sin Eater, you must first understand the weight of sin as it was conceived in this era. Sin was not merely a moral failing or a spiritual concern. It was a tangible burden, something that could accumulate and cling to a person throughout their life, growing heavier with each transgression, each moment of weakness, each failure to live up to the impossible standards of perfect Christian virtue. When death approached, this weight became a crisis of urgent proportions. The dying person faced the terrifying prospect of appearing before divine judgment, carrying every lie they had told, every moment of anger they had harbored, every small cruelty they had inflicted or allowed. The Catholic doctrine of purgatory offered some hope sins might be purged through suffering in that intermediate realm, but even this was a prospect that filled people with dread. It was into this spiritual anxiety that the Sin Eater stepped, offering a service so strange, so removed from conventional religious practice that it existed in a space the church could neither fully condemn nor officially sanction. The sin eater would take upon himself the sins of the deceased, absorbing them through a ritual consumption of bread and ale, performed over the corpse in the presence of the grieving family. But let us be clear about what this meant for the sin eater himself. Each time he performed this ritual, he was not merely play-acting or performing an empty ceremony. In the belief system of his time and place, he was genuinely taking on the spiritual pollution of another person's entire lifetime. Imagine the weight of that, not just the knowledge of having absorbed one person's sins, but dozens, perhaps hundreds over the course of a career. The sin eater accumulated spiritual debt like sediment in a riverbed, layer upon layer, year after year. By the time a sin eater reached old age, he carried within himself a vast catalog of human failing. The adultery of a merchant's wife, the dishonesty of a farmer who cheated on his measures, the cruelty of a father who beat his children, the pride of a woman who looked down on her neighbors, the greed of a landowner who turned out tenants in winter. When word came that someone was dying, or more often, that someone had already died, a messenger would make the uncomfortable journey to the sin eater's cottage. Sometimes this messenger was a family member, more often a servant sent by the family, occasionally the local priest's assistant. The conversation would be brief, transactional. A name, a location, sometimes a few details about when and where the ritual should take place. The sin eater would gather his simple tools, a wooden plate, a pewter cup if he owned one, and whatever clothing he reserved for these occasions. His attire was neither ceremonial nor particularly fine, perhaps a dark coat if he owned one, more often simply his cleanest available clothing. There was no uniform for sin eaters, no official vestments. They operated in the spaces between official religion and folk practice, borrowing authority from neither church nor state. The journey to the house of the deceased was always made alone. No companion would want to be associated with such work, and the sin eater had long ago grown accustomed to solitude. He might walk along the same paths he had traveled for decades, passing houses where he had performed the ritual before, noting which families had used his services repeatedly, which had called upon him only once. Upon arrival, he would find a household arranged around death in ways that followed ancient patterns. The body would have been washed and dressed, often laid out in the main room of the house on a table or board. Candles would be burning, creating pools of flickering light that made the shadows dance across the walls. The family members would be present, but their positioning relative to the sin eater told its own story. They needed him, but they feared him. They required his service, but they could not bear to be too close to him while he performed it. So they would arrange themselves at a careful distance, close enough to witness that the ritual was properly completed, far enough to avoid contamination by proximity. The bread placed upon the corpse's chest was usually coarse, dark bread, not the fine white bread that might grace a wealthy table, but the everyday bread of working people. Sometimes the family provided ale, sometimes small beer, occasionally wine if they could afford such luxury for the dead. The sin eater would take the bread and drink, consuming them slowly and deliberately, while reciting words that had been passed down through generations of sin eaters, words that existed in no prayer book, no official liturgy. As he ate and drank, the family watched in silence. There was no celebration here, no relief, only the tense anticipation of a necessary but uncomfortable transaction being completed. The sin eater might speak the name of the deceased, might recite a litany of the types of sins he was taking upon himself, or might simply eat in contemplative silence while the spiritual transfer was believed to take place. The payment for such services was always modest, often insultingly, so given the magnitude of what was supposedly being transacted. A few pennies, perhaps a shilling if the family was generous or wealthy. Sometimes payment came in the form of fouda, a piece of cheese, some butter, bread for the sin eater's own table. Occasionally, when called to serve a more prosperous household, There might be a cast-off piece of clothing or a household item the family no longer needed. But the economics of sin eating went far beyond these immediate payments. The sin eater existed in a state of permanent economic marginality, unable to engage in most other forms of work because of the spiritual contamination his profession was believed to carry. A farmer wouldn't want a sin eater handling his grain. A baker wouldn't want him kneading bread that others would eat. A carpenter wouldn't want tools that had been touched by hands that had absorbed so much spiritual pollution. This created a terrible irony. The sin eater performed a service that families desperately wanted, but his performance of that service made him increasingly unemployable in any other capacity. Each ritual he performed made him more necessary to his community and simultaneously more isolated from it. The sin eater might supplement his income in small ways that didn't require social interaction. He might keep a few chickens, tend a vegetable garden, perhaps craft simple items that could be sold without face-to-face contact. But these were always marginal activities, barely sufficient to sustain life, never enough to provide comfort or security. The sin eater's world was defined by boundaries, the physical boundaries that kept him at the edges of community space, and the social boundaries that governed every interaction he might have with other people. When he walked through the village, which he did rarely and only when necessary, people would cross to the other side of the street. Conversations would stop when he approached, resuming only after he had passed. Children, with their keener sensitivity to adult anxiety, often reacted to the sin eater with outright fear. They had been warned about him in whispers, told stories that painted him as something between a necessary servant and a dangerous monster. Some parents used the sin eater as a threat. Behave, or the sin eater will come for you. Others tried to shield their children from even knowing such a person existed. The sin eater learned to move through the world as quietly as possible, to make himself small and unobtrusive, to avoid drawing attention that might result in hostility or fear. He shopped for necessities at times when the market was nearly empty, dealt with merchants who were willing to conduct business with him because they needed his money more than they feared his contamination. Weather became a significant factor in the sin eater's life, not just for physical comfort, but for the practical realities of his work. A harsh winter might mean fewer deaths, but also fewer opportunities for income. A particularly wet season might make the roads to remote farms impassable when his services were needed. The sin eater lived with an awareness of seasonal cycles that was tied not to agricultural rhythms, but to mortality patterns. The cottage where the sin eater lived often reflected this isolation in its physical details. Windows might be smaller than in neighboring houses, not just for warmth, but to avoid too much visibility into or out of the dwelling. The garden, if maintained at all, would be planted with practical rather than decorative considerations. Herbs that might be useful for a man living alone, vegetables that could be stored through winter, perhaps medicinal plants that reflected the sin eater's intimate familiarity with human suffering. But perhaps the most profound aspect of the sin eater's existence was the weight of his spiritual situation. By the belief system of his era, he was accumulating sin upon sin, lifetime after lifetime, with no clear mechanism for redemption. The church, which offered confession and absolution to others, maintained an uneasy relationship with sin eaters. Some priests refused to acknowledge their existence. Others grudgingly accepted that they served some purpose in God's mysterious plan. Very few were willing to offer the sin eater the same spiritual comfort they provided to other members of their flock. This created a terrible theological puzzle for the sin eater himself. If he truly believed in the efficacy of his own work, if he accepted that he was genuinely absorbing the sins of the deceased, then he had to live with the knowledge that his own soul was becoming progressively more burdened. Yet if he doubted the reality of the spiritual transfer he facilitated, then he was taking money from grieving families for a service that provided no actual benefit. Most sin eaters seem to have resolved this dilemma by developing a fatalistic acceptance of their role. They became men who had made peace with their own damnation in service to others' salvation. There was a terrible nobility in this, a sacrifice that was both profound and largely unrecognized by the communities they served. The sin-eater might spend long evenings alone in his cottage, contemplating the catalogue of human weakness he had absorbed. Did the sins of others weigh differently than his own might have? Could he distinguish between the spiritual pollution of a murderer and that of a woman who had gossiped about her neighbors? The theological complexities of his situation were staggering. Verse 2, Burke and Hare, the resurrection men of Edinburgh, in the early 19th century, was a city of profound contradictions, and nowhere were these contradictions more apparent than in its relationship with death and learning. The city had earned its reputation as the Athens of the North, a center of intellectual achievement where the medical school at the University of Edinburgh drew students from across Europe and beyond. Yet this same pursuit of knowledge created a demand that the law could not legally satisfy: the need for human bodies for anatomical study. Picture the narrow, winding streets of Edinburgh's Old Town in 1828, where medieval buildings lean toward each other across cobblestone alleys, creating deep shadows even in daylight. The air carries the scent of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else, the persistent odor of decay that seems to cling to certain neighborhoods, certain professions. This is a city where progress and desperation exist side by side, where the pursuit of medical knowledge bumps up against ancient taboos about the sanctity of the dead. In this environment, a particular type of entrepreneur emerged: men who called themselves resurrection men, or more colloquially, body snatchers. They served the medical schools by providing what the law made nearly impossible to obtain legally: fresh human corpses for dissection. The work was grim, dangerous, and profitable enough to attract men who were already living on society's margins. Among these resurrection men, two names would become infamous, not for their grave robbing, but for the terrible efficiency with which they eliminated the middle step of waiting for people to die naturally. William Burke and William Hare didn't just steal bodies, they created them. William Burke arrived in Edinburgh sometime around 1818, a middle-aged Irishman with the weathered hands of a laborer and the easy charm that would later prove so deadly. He had worked various jobs: canal digger, baker's assistant, general laborer, the kind of work that was always available for men who weren't particular about conditions or pay. By 1827, he was living with a woman named Helen McDougall in the Westport area of Edinburgh, one of the city's poorer neighborhoods where Irish immigrants clustered together for mutual support and shared misery. It was in this neighborhood that Burke encountered William Hare, another Irish immigrant who had managed to achieve a slightly higher social position as the keeper of a lodging house. Hare's establishment was typical of such places: a ramshackle building where the desperately poor could rent a bed for a few pence a night, or even just floor space if beds weren't available. The clientele was transient, anonymous, and often sickly. People came and went without leaving much trace of their existence. The partnership between Burke and Hare began with death, as it would continue and end. An elderly tenant in Hare's lodging house died, owing £4 in rent, a substantial sum for people living at the margins of subsistence. Rather than simply absorbing the loss, Hare convinced Burke to help him carry the corpse to the medical school, where they discovered that fresh bodies commanded excellent prices from anatomists desperate for teaching materials. The sale of that first corpse was a revelation for both men. Here was work that required no particular skill, no significant investment, and no competition for more respectable members of society. The medical men who purchased bodies asked no uncomfortable questions about provenance, maintaining a willful ignorance that allowed the entire system to function. What happened next reveals something disturbing about how quickly moral boundaries can shift when financial incentives align with opportunity. Burke and Hare had discovered that fresh corpses were worth considerably more than those that had been buried and later exhumed. Bodies that were still warm, still flexible, that showed no signs of decay. These commanded premium prices from anatomists who valued them for their teaching utility. The progression from grave robbing to murder wasn't dramatic or sudden. It began with another sick tenant in Hare's lodging house, an old man named Joseph, who was clearly dying but taking an inconveniently long time about it. Burke and Hare began providing him with whiskey, ostensibly as comfort for his suffering, but actually to hasten his death. When Joseph finally succumbed, they sold his body for £10 more than most working men earned in a month. The ease of this transaction, the ready money, the lack of investigation or awkward questions, created a template that Burke and Hare would follow with increasingly bold variations. They began targeting the most vulnerable members of Edinburgh's population, people whose disappearances were unlikely to be noticed or investigated. The elderly, the infirm, the friendless, the drunk. People who existed on the very edges of society, whose lives were already so marginal that their deaths created barely a ripple. The method they developed was almost mundane in its efficiency. They would befriend their victims, usually in one of Edinburgh's many taverns, offering drinks and companionship to people who rarely experienced either. The victims would be invited back to Hare's lodging house, where they would be plied with more alcohol until they were helplessly intoxicated. Then, working together, Burke and Hare would smother their victims, a method that left no obvious marks of violence and created corpses that appeared to have died naturally. The business model that Burke and Hare developed was frighteningly efficient. They had identified a market need, the medical school's requirement for fresh cadavers, and found a way to supply that need more reliably than their competitors. While other resurrection men had to wait for natural deaths and then engage in the risky work of grave robbing, Burke and Hare were manufacturing their own inventory. Their primary customer was Dr. Robert Knox, one of Edinburgh's most prominent anatomists, who conducted popular private anatomy classes that supplemented the official university curriculum. Knox was a charismatic lecturer who drew large audiences to his demonstrations, and his success depended partly on having access to the freshest, most anatomically perfect specimens. He paid well for quality and asked no questions about source. The relationship between Knox and the two resurrection men illustrates the willful blindness that enabled the entire system. Knox certainly knew that the bodies he was purchasing couldn't all be coming from natural deaths and legitimate grave robbing. The frequency of delivery, the consistent quality of the specimens, the fact that Burke and Hare always seemed to have fresh inventory available, all of this should have raised questions that Knox chose not to ask. But Knox, like the other anatomists who purchased bodies from resurrection men, existed in a world where scientific advancement was considered to justify almost any means. The study of human anatomy was essential for training competent physicians, and the law provided no adequate legal source for the cadavers this training required. In this context, it was easy to rationalize accepting whatever bodies became available, regardless of their suspicious provenance. Burke and Hare were earning substantial sums from their gruesome enterprise, typically £8 to £10 per body, sometimes more for particularly fresh or anatomically interesting specimens. This was more money than either man had ever seen from legitimate work, enough to transform their living conditions and social status within their limited sphere. The people Burke and Hare murdered were not random victims, but carefully selected targets chosen for their vulnerability and isolation. Mary Patterson was a young prostitute, attractive enough that Dr. Knox's students were reportedly excited to dissect such a beautiful specimen. James Wilson, known as Daft Jamie, was a mentally disabled young man who was well known in the streets of Edinburgh for his harmless, eccentric behavior. His disappearance was one of the few that was actually noticed, creating some of the first whispers of suspicion about Burke and Hare's activities. Each victim represents a particular type of social invisibility that existed in early 19th century Edinburgh. The city's rapid growth and industrialization had created large populations of people who existed outside traditional social structures: immigrants, the unemployed, the disabled, the mentally ill, women who survived through prostitution. These were people whose lives were already precarious, whose deaths wouldn't necessarily trigger investigations or even much notice. Burke and Hare understood this social landscape intuitively. They knew which people could disappear without consequences, which victims wouldn't be missed, which deaths wouldn't be questioned. Their selection of targets reveals a sophisticated understanding of power dynamics and social hierarchies that was perhaps more chilling than the murders themselves. The victims were typically killed in Hare's lodging house, in rooms that had been rented by dozens of transient tenants over the years. The building itself became complicit in the murders, its thin walls and transient population creating an environment where screams might be attributed to drunkenness, where the smell of death could be masked by the general odors of poverty and poor sanitation. The partnership between Burke and Hare lasted approximately 10 months, during which they murdered at least 16 people, though the actual number may have been higher. Their downfall came not through careful investigation, but through the kind of coincidence that often brings criminal enterprises to an end. In October 1828, Burke and Hare murdered an elderly Irish woman named Marjorie Campbell Docherty. They had lured her to Hare's lodging house with their usual combination of alcohol and false friendship. But this time, they made a crucial error. Other tenants in the building became suspicious when Docherty disappeared overnight, particularly after they discovered her body hidden under a bed. The discovery led to the arrest of both Burke and Hare, along with their female companions, Helen McDougall and Margaret Hare. But the legal proceedings that followed revealed the limitations of the criminal justice system when dealing with crimes that challenged social boundaries and conventional expectations. The problem facing the authorities was that proving murder in these cases was extremely difficult. Burke and Hare had chosen their method specifically to avoid leaving obvious signs of violence. Their victims appeared to have died naturally, and the bodies had been sold to anatomists who had dissected them, destroying most physical evidence of how death had occurred. Faced with the difficulty of proving multiple murders, the authorities made a pragmatic decision that would secure at least one conviction. They offered Hare immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony against Burke. This arrangement reflected the legal system's need for resolution, while acknowledging the practical challenges of investigating crimes that occurred in Edinburgh's underworld. Hare's testimony revealed the full scope of their partnership and provided the details necessary to convict Burke. But the trial also exposed the complicity of the wider community in maintaining systems that enabled such crimes. Dr. Knox, while never charged, faced public condemnation for his role in creating the market that Burke and Hare had supplied. The medical establishment was forced to confront the ethical implications of their willful ignorance about the sources of their anatomical specimens. Burke was convicted and sentenced to death, but even his execution became part of the larger story about Edinburgh's relationship with death and knowledge. In a final irony, Burke's own body was publicly dissected after his hanging, his skeleton preserved and displayed as a warning against similar crimes. The crowds that gathered to watch his execution were enormous, reflecting public fascination with a case that had revealed uncomfortable truths about the connections between scientific progress and moral compromise. Hare, despite his immunity, found himself unable to remain in Edinburgh after the trial. Public hatred for both men made his continued presence in the city impossible. He disappeared from historical records after leaving Edinburgh, though rumors and alleged sightings persisted for years. Some claimed he had fled to Ireland, others that he had emigrated to America. The uncertainty surrounding his fate became part of the Burke and Hare legend, adding an element of unresolved justice to an already disturbing story. The Burke and Hare murders had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate legal proceedings. The case exposed fundamental problems with the laws governing anatomical study and forced society to confront the contradictions between scientific necessity and moral tradition. The public revulsion at the murders led to the passage of the Anatomy Act of 1832, which for the first time provided a legal source of bodies for medical schools. The new law allowed medical institutions to claim the bodies of people who died in workhouses and hospitals without family to claim them, finally creating a legitimate supply chain for anatomical specimens. But the Burke and Hare case also left a lasting mark on public consciousness, contributing to enduring fears about medical professionals and their relationship with death. The idea that doctors might be complicit in murder, that medical schools might be markets for stolen bodies, became embedded in popular culture and folklore. The neighborhood where Burke and Hare operated retained their association for decades. Hare's lodging house became a site of morbid curiosity, attracting visitors who wanted to see where the murders had taken place. The building itself eventually fell into decay and was demolished, but its memory persisted in local stories and legends. Perhaps most significantly, the Burke and Hare murders illustrated how easily moral boundaries could be crossed when financial incentives aligned with social invisibility. The victims were people whose lives had already been devalued by society, making their deaths seem less significant to those who profited from them. This pattern, the exploitation of society's most vulnerable members by those who saw them as resources rather than human beings, would unfortunately prove to be a recurring theme in history. The partnership between Burke and Hare lasted less than a year, but it revealed truths about human nature and social structures that remain uncomfortable to contemplate. In the narrow alleys of Edinburgh's Old Town, in the dim rooms of a decrepit lodging house, two men discovered how profitable death could be when combined with society's willingness to look the other way. Their story serves as a reminder that progress and civilization are always fragile constructs, dependent on moral agreements that can be abandoned when convenience and profit provide sufficient motivation. In their methodical conversion of living people into medical specimens, Burke and Hare crossed boundaries that most people prefer to believe are uncrossable, revealing possibilities that continue to haunt our understanding of what humans are capable of doing to each other. Verse 3. The gong farmer, Tudor London's night soil men. In the darkness of a Tudor night, when the last candles have been extinguished in the windows of London's timber-framed houses, when the streets have emptied of all but the most desperate or the most drunk, a different kind of worker begins his shift. The gong farmer emerges from whatever humble dwelling he calls home, carrying tools that no other tradesman would touch, preparing for work that forms the hidden foundation upon which all civilized life depends. To understand the Gong farmer, you must first understand Tudor London as a city built upon a fundamental contradiction. Here was England's greatest metropolis, a center of trade and learning, home to the royal court and the emerging merchant class. Yet it was also a place where human waste accumulated in quantities that defied the capacity of any medieval sanitation system to manage. London in the 16th century was a city of perhaps 200,000 souls, all of them producing the biological waste that comes with human existence. The wealthy had private guardrabes built into their houses, often constructed to hang over rivers or streams. The middle classes shared communal latrines, sometimes built over specially dug pits. The poor made do with whatever arrangements they could manage, often simply using whatever space was available and hoping someone else would deal with the consequences. But all of these systems, from the most elaborate to the most primitive, eventually led to the same problem: the accumulation of human waste in quantities that threatened to overwhelm the city's ability to function. Cesspits filled up. Private latrines reached capacity. The very success of London as a growing, thriving city created sanitation challenges that required solutions both practical and profound. Enter the Gong farmer, a figure whose very name reveals something about how Tudor society attempted to manage the psychological discomfort of necessary but unpleasant work. Gong was a medieval term for a privy or latrine, while farmer suggested someone who cultivated or harvested something of value. The Gong farmer harvested what others produced but could not use, transforming waste into something that could be removed, processed, and ultimately put to productive use. The Gong farmer worked exclusively at night, and this was not merely a practical consideration, but a fundamental requirement, both legal and social. Tudor law actually mandated that Gong farmers could only perform their duties between the hours of 9 p.m. and 5 a.m., ensuring that their work remained invisible to the daytime world of respectable society. This legal requirement reflected a deeper understanding about the psychological necessities of urban life. City dwellers needed to believe in the fiction that waste simply disappeared, that the unpleasant realities of human biology could be managed without intruding on daily consciousness. The Gong farmer's nocturnal schedule allowed this fiction to persist, enabling people to live their daylight lives without confronting the men who made those lives possible. Imagine the Gong farmer beginning his shift as the sun sets over the Thames, transforming London from a bustling commercial center into something altogether more mysterious and threatening. The streets that had been filled with merchants, apprentices, housewives, and children during the day became the domain of different populations after dark. The watch making their rounds, prostitutes conducting their business, thieves looking for opportunities, and the Gong farmers beginning their methodical progress through the city's waste management infrastructure. The tools of the trade were simple but specialized. A long-handled shovel designed to reach into the depths of cesspits without requiring the worker to climb down into them. Buckets of various sizes, often reinforced with iron bands to handle the weight and corrosive nature of their contents. A cart, usually drawn by a single horse or mule that had been trained to tolerate the odors associated with this particular type of cargo. Sometimes a lantern, though Gong farmers often worked by touch and familiarity rather than sight, knowing their routes and destinations so well that they could navigate them in complete darkness. To comprehend the Gong farmer's world, you must engage with sensory realities that most historical accounts politely avoid. The smell, first and foremost, was overwhelming in ways that modern people, accustomed to flush toilets and municipal sewage systems, can barely imagine. This wasn't simply the odor of human waste, but waste that had been accumulating for months or even years, fermenting in enclosed spaces, developing complex aromatic profiles that included elements of decay, putrefaction, and chemical transformation. The Gong farmer developed a professional relationship with these odors, learning to distinguish between the smells of different types of waste, different stages of decomposition, different levels of danger. Fresh waste posed different challenges than aged waste. The contents of a wealthy household cesspit smelled different from those of a poor family's shared latrine. Certain odors warned of dangerous gases that could render a worker unconscious or even kill him. But smell was only one element of the sensory experience. The texture of the work was equally challenging. Gong farmers worked with materials that ranged from liquid slurry to solid masses, from relatively fresh deposits to waste they had transformed into something resembling soil. They learned to gauge the consistency of waste by the way their shovels moved through it, developing a tactile expertise that allowed them to work efficiently, even in complete darkness. The sounds of the work created their own landscape. The splash of waste being transferred from pit to bucket, the creak of cartwheels on cobblestones, the snorting of horses that never quite became accustomed to their cargo, the occasional curse when a worker encountered an unexpected obstacle or particularly challenging deposit. These sounds became the night music of Tudor London's waste management system, a hidden symphony that played out while the city slept. Despite the unpleasant nature of their work, Gong farmers were surprisingly well compensated by the standards of their time. The combination of essential necessity and universal reluctance to perform the work created a labor market where Gong farmers could command wages that were often higher than those earned by more respectable tradesmen. A skilled Gong farmer might earn as much as a carpenter or mason, and considerably more than an agricultural laborer. The work was steady human beings produce waste with reliable consistency, and the demand was guaranteed to continue as long as the city existed. There were no seasonal fluctuations, no dependency on weather or economic conditions. People needed their cesspits emptied regardless of whether times were good or bad, whether the harvest had been successful or had failed. But the high wages came with significant hidden costs. Gong farmers found it difficult to spend their money in ways that might improve their social status because their profession marked them as fundamentally different from other members of society. They might be able to afford better housing, but landlords were reluctant to rent to them. They might have money for fine clothing, but wearing it would create a jarring contrast with their occupation that made others uncomfortable. The Gong farmers' wealth was also somewhat illusory because it came at the cost of social isolation and health risks that couldn't be calculated in purely monetary terms. The constant exposure to human waste and the gases it produced took a toll on their health that shortened lifespans and reduced quality of life in ways that no amount of money could completely compensate for. The Gong farmers' London was a different city from the one experienced by other residents. While merchants knew the city through its markets and trading posts, while craftsmen understood it through the locations of their workshops and the homes of their customers, the Gong farmer navigated London through its waste infrastructure. He knew which neighborhoods produced the most waste, which households were most punctual about scheduling cleanings, which cesspits were well maintained, and which were on the verge of dangerous collapse. His mental map of the city was organized around practical considerations that were invisible to everyone else. The width of alleys that determined whether his cart could reach a particular cesspit, the location of dumping grounds where waste could be deposited, the houses of wealthy clients who paid premium prices for discreet and thorough service. The Gong farmer developed relationships with other members of London's nocturnal economy, the night watchmen who might look the other way when waste carts blocked narrow streets, the tavern keepers who stayed open late and were willing to serve customers, whose occupation made them unwelcome in more respectable establishments, the carters and haulers who helped transport waste to dumping grounds outside the city walls. Tudor London's waste management system was more sophisticated than might be expected, involving a complex network of collection, transportation, and disposal that required coordination between multiple parties. The Gong farmer was the crucial link in this system, but he was supported by carters who hauled waste to rural areas where it could be used as fertilizer, by farmers who were willing to purchase human waste for agricultural purposes, and by officials who managed the licensing and regulation of the entire enterprise. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Gong farmer's work was its role in the larger cycle of urban metabolism. What he removed from London cesspits didn't simply disappear. It was transformed into something useful through a process that connected the city to the surrounding agricultural areas in ways that modern urban dwellers rarely consider. Human waste, despite its unpleasant characteristics, was a valuable commodity in the agricultural economy of Tudor England. It was rich in nitrogen and other nutrients that made it an excellent fertilizer, particularly for certain types of crops. Market gardens around London depended on the steady supply of human waste that Gong farmers provided, creating an economic relationship that turned the city's sanitation problem into a source of agricultural productivity. The Gong farmer was thus a crucial participant in a circular economy that preceded modern environmental thinking by several centuries. He took waste from the city and delivered it to farmers who used it to grow food that was then sold back to city dwellers, creating a closed loop that minimized waste while maximizing productivity. This transformation required knowledge and skill that went beyond simple waste removal. The Gong farmer had to understand which types of waste were suitable for different agricultural purposes, how to transport it without creating health hazards, how to process it in ways that made it safe and effective as fertilizer. He was, in effect, an early waste management specialist whose expertise encompassed both urban sanitation and agricultural science. The Gong farmer occupied a unique position in Tudor society, simultaneously essential and reviled, well-paid and socially marginalized. His work made civilized urban life possible, yet performing it placed him outside the bounds of civilized society. This paradox created psychological and social challenges that went far beyond the merely physical difficulties of the work itself. Gong farmers developed their own subculture, their own social networks, their own ways of finding dignity and meaning in work that others considered degrading. They might gather in taverns that specialized in serving the city's nocturnal workers, sharing stories and techniques, comparing wages and working conditions, finding camaraderie with others who understood the unique challenges of their profession. The families of Gong farmers faced particular difficulties. Children growing up in Gong farming households had to navigate the stigma associated with their fathers, work while also dealing with the practical realities of living with someone whose profession marked him as fundamentally different from other members of society. Wives of Gong farmers occupied an ambiguous social position, neither fully accepted by respectable society nor completely ostracized from it. Yet there was also a kind of security in the Gong farmer's position that other workers might envy. His skills were not easily replaced, his services were always in demand, and his income was more reliable than that of workers in trades that were subject to economic fluctuations or seasonal variations. The Gong farmer might be socially marginalized, but he was also economically essential in ways that gave him a certain independence and security. The work of the Gong farmer involved risks that went far beyond social stigma and unpleasant odors. Cesspits could be dangerous environments where toxic gases accumulated, where structural collapse was always possible, where workers could be overcome by fumes or trapped by cave-ins. Many cesspits produced methane and hydrogen sulfide gases that could cause unconsciousness or death if proper precautions weren't taken. The Gong farmer had to develop an intuitive understanding of these dangers, learning to recognize warning signs, knowing when to retreat from a job that had become too hazardous to continue safely. The physical demands of the work were also considerable. Gong farmers spent long hours bent over cesspits, shoveling heavy, wet materials, working in cramped spaces that put tremendous strain on their backs and joints. The repetitive nature of the work, combined with the toxic environment in which it was performed, took a cumulative toll on their health. Verse 4. The Victorian mudlark, children of the Thames foreshore in the grey dawn light of Victorian London. As the Thames retreats with the falling tide, a strange landscape emerges from beneath the dark waters. Miles of muddy foreshore stretch along the river's banks, revealing a hidden world that exists in the space between land and water, between the respectable city above and the mysterious depths below. This is the domain of the mudlark, those figures often children who pick their way across the treacherous mud, searching for anything that might have value in the harsh economy of Victorian poverty. Picture the Thames in the 1850s, not as the tourist attraction it would later become, but as London's great artery of commerce and waste disposal. Everything that the city produced or consumed passed through this river coal from the northern counties, grain from foreign ports, manufactured goods bound for distant markets, and alongside all this commerce, the detritus of urban life. The river was simultaneously London's highway and its garbage dump, its source of prosperity and its repository for everything the city no longer wanted. The mudlarks understood this dual nature of the Thames better than perhaps anyone else in London. They knew that the river gave and took with equal measure, that its mud concealed both treasures and dangers, that survival along its banks required a particular kind of knowledge that could only be gained through years of patient observation and painful experience. To be a mudlark was to live in a world that most Londoners never saw, existing in the margins between the visible city and the hidden infrastructure that made urban life possible. The mudlark's London was not the London of gaslit streets and bustling markets, but the London of low tide and exposed riverbed, of dawn searches and evening tallies, of survival measured in pennies and pence. A mudlark was, in essence, an urban archaeologist, though the term wouldn't have meant anything to a Victorian child scraping survival from the Thames foreshore. But the work was fundamentally archaeological, the systematic investigation of human-made deposits in search of objects that could reveal information about the people who had discarded them. Every tide brought new possibilities to the mudlark's hunting ground. The Thames was constantly redistributing London's refuse, carrying objects from upstream neighborhoods down to the lower reaches of the river, depositing them at low tide, covering them again when the waters rose. A piece of coal dropped from a barge might wash ashore miles from where it fell. A button lost from a gentleman's coat might travel for days before finding its way to a mudbank where a sharp-eyed child could spot it gleaming in the morning light. The mudlark learned to read the river's moods and patterns. Spring tides that rose higher and fell lower than usual might reveal objects that had been buried for months or even years. Storm runoff could wash valuable debris from the city's gutters and sewers directly into the Thames, creating temporary bonanzas for those quick enough to exploit them. The mudlark developed an intimate understanding of tidal schedules, knowing precisely when and where the best hunting would be available. But the Thames foreshore was not simply a repository of accidentally lost objects. It was also where London disposed of things deliberately, creating a complex archaeological record of Victorian consumption and waste. Broken pottery from middle-class households, worn-out tools from workshops, bones from butcher shops, glass bottles from pubs and private homes, all of this found its way into the river, creating a vast museum of Victorian material culture that the mudlarks excavated one piece at a time. The mudlark operated within a complex economy that transformed worthless, refused into survival-level income through the application of specialized knowledge and backbreaking labor. Every object retrieved from the Thames mud had to be evaluated for its potential value, and this evaluation required understanding multiple markets and uses that might not be obvious to casual observers. Coal was perhaps the most reliable source of income for mudlarks. London's enormous appetite for fuel meant that coal was constantly being transported along the Thames, and inevitably, some was lost overboard or spilled during loading and unloading. A single piece of coal might not seem valuable, but accumulated over a day's work, coal could provide enough income to purchase food for a family. The mudlark learned to distinguish between different grades of coal, to know which types burned best, and commanded the highest prices from dealers who purchased salvaged fuel. Metal objects offered another category of valuable salvage. Iron nails, copper fittings, lead pipes, Brass buttons, all of these had value to scrap dealers who would purchase them by weight. The mudlark developed an eye for metal objects that might be easily overlooked, learning to spot the dull gleam of lead or copper beneath layers of Thames mud, knowing which metals were worth the effort of retrieval and cleaning. Rope represented a particularly valuable find because it could be sold to marine suppliers who served the constant traffic of ships along the Thames. Even damaged rope had value. It could be unraveled and the fibers sold to manufacturers of cheaper cordage or used by the mudlark's own family for various domestic purposes. A length of good rope could represent a week's worth of ordinary salvage work. But perhaps the most poignant category of mudlark salvage was the personal objects that found their way into the fall. Thames, the coins dropped by passengers boarding boats, the jewelry lost during riverside walks, the household goods that had fallen from carts or been discarded during moves. These objects connected the mudlark to the lives of people who occupied completely different social worlds, creating brief moments of contact across the vast class divisions that structured Victorian society. Many mudlarks were children, some as young as 8 or 9 years old, who had been forced into this dangerous and marginal existence by family circumstances that left them with few other options for survival. These were not the romantically depicted street children of Victorian literature, but actual children facing real hunger, real cold, real danger in their daily struggle to earn enough money to stay alive. The child mudlark faced challenges that went far beyond the obvious dangers of working along a tidal river. The work required getting up before dawn to take advantage of the best opportunities at low tide, spending hours bent over searching through mud and refuse, competing with other mudlarks for the choicest salvage locations, and then spending additional hours cleaning and sorting the day's finds in preparation for sale. The physical demands of mudlarking were particularly severe for children. The Thames mud was not simply dirty. It was often contaminated with industrial waste, human sewage, and chemicals from the factories and tanneries that lined the river. Children working in this environment developed skin conditions, respiratory problems, and other health issues that reflected the toxic nature of their workplace. Yet these children also developed remarkable resilience and expertise. They learned to move safely across mud that could trap an unwary adult, to recognize dangerous areas where the footing was uncertain, to work efficiently in conditions that would challenge much older and stronger workers. The child mudlark became a specialist in urban survival, developing skills that were simultaneously impressive and heartbreaking in their necessity. The social dynamics among mudlarks were complex, involving competition for the best locations balanced against cooperation necessary for safety and mutual support. Experienced mudlarks might take younger children under their protection, teaching them the skills necessary for survival, while also establishing territories and hierarchies that governed access to the most productive areas. The Thames foreshore was not a uniform hunting ground, but a complex landscape of different zones, each with its own characteristics, opportunities, and dangers. The mudlark learned to navigate this geography with the precision of a professional surveyor, understanding how different areas related to the city above, and how these relationships affected what might be found in each location. Near the docks and wharves, the foreshore was littered with the debris of commercial activity, broken crates, damaged cargo, spilled bulk commodities like grain or coal. These areas offered the possibility of substantial finds, but were also more closely watched by dock workers and police who might chase away unauthorized scavengers. In residential areas, particularly near the outfalls of sewers and storm drains, the mudlark might find household objects that had been washed into the river during heavy rains. These areas were less supervised, but also less predictable in their offerings, requiring patience and persistence rather than quick opportunism. Below the industrial areas, the factories, breweries, and chemical works that lined the Thames, the foreshore, took on different characteristics. Here the mud might be stained with dyes or contaminated with industrial waste, but it might also contain valuable byproducts or materials that had been discarded as waste but retained value in other contexts. The mudlark's mental map of the Thames foreshore was organized around tidal schedules, seasonal patterns, and the rhythms of urban and commercial activity. They knew which areas were best searched at different times of day, which locations were most productive after storms, which stretches of riverbank were likely to yield particular types of objects. Working along the Thames foreshore involved constant awareness of the tide and its dangers. The Thames is a tidal river, with water levels rising and falling dramatically twice each day. A mudlark who became too absorbed in their work, or who ventured too far from shore, could find themselves cut off by rising water with potentially fatal consequences. The mudlark learned to read the subtle signs that indicated changing tidal conditions, the direction of small currents, the sound of water moving over mudbanks, the behavior of birds and other wildlife that lived along the river. This knowledge was literally a matter of life and death, requiring constant vigilance and an intuitive understanding of natural rhythms that could not be learned from books or formal instruction. But the tide was not the only danger. The Thames mud itself could be treacherous, with areas of deep, soft sediment that could trap someone who stepped carelessly. Abandoned objects buried in the mud might include sharp metal edges, broken glass, or chemicals that could cause serious injury. The mudlark developed a cautious, methodical approach to their work that minimized these risks while still allowing for productive searching. The river also carried human dangers. The mudlark worked in areas that were largely unsupervised, making them vulnerable to robbery, assault, or worse from criminals who saw them as easy targets. Their marginal social status meant that crimes against mudlarks were unlikely to be investigated seriously, creating an environment where violence was always a possibility. The mudlark occupied a position of almost complete social invisibility in Victorian London. Their work took place at times and in locations where respectable society rarely ventured, allowing them to perform essential functions, recycling valuable materials, cleaning the river of debris without intruding on the consciousness of more fortunate Londoners. This invisibility was both protective and isolating. It allowed mudlarks to work without constant harassment from authorities or interference from property owners, but it also meant that their needs and problems were rarely acknowledged by social reformers or charitable organizations. The mudlark existed in a social blind spot, noticed only when their activities somehow inconvenienced more respectable members of society. The relationship between mudlarks and the broader economy was complex and often contradictory. Their salvage work served important economic functions, recovering valuable materials, cleaning the river, providing cheap raw materials to various industries. Yet this contribution was never formally recognized or rewarded. The mudlark was simultaneously part of London's economic system and excluded from its benefits. Victorian social reformers occasionally discovered the mudlarks and wrote shocked accounts of their living conditions. But these discoveries rarely led to sustained efforts at improvement. The mudlark's problems were too complex, too rooted in broader patterns of poverty and social exclusion, to be easily addressed through charitable intervention or moral reform. The mudlark's day began before dawn, when the tide was at its lowest point, and the greatest expanse of foreshore was exposed for searching. This timing was not optional. It was dictated by natural forces that could not be negotiated or avoided. The mudlark rose in darkness, gathered whatever tools were necessary for the day's work, and made their way to the river while most of London still slept. The morning search was systematic and methodical, covering assigned or claimed territory with a thoroughness that came from understanding. That survival depended on not missing anything of potential value. The mudlark worked with focused concentration, alert for the gleam of metal, the regular shape of manufactured objects, the unexpected texture that might indicate something worth investigating. As the tide began to turn and water started to reclaim the foreshore, the mudlark would retreat to higher ground, carrying the morning's harvest to areas where it could be sorted, cleaned, and prepared for sale. This processing work was almost as important as the initial collection, because the difference between successful sale and worthless refuse often lay in the mudlark's ability to clean and present objects in ways that revealed their potential value. The afternoon might involve visiting dealers and scrap merchants, negotiating prices for the day's finds, converting salvaged objects into the small amounts of money that made survival possible. These transactions required their own form of expertise understanding, which dealers paid the best prices for different types of materials. Knowing how to present objects to maximize their apparent value, developing relationships with purchasers who could be trusted to deal fairly with mudlarks. As the 19th century conclusion, so now, as we gently leave behind the flickering candlelight of the Sin Eater's lonely cottage, the shadowed corridors of Burke and Hare's grim enterprise, the damp echoing alleys of London's cesspits, and the grey, glistening banks of the Thames where children once hunted treasure in the muck, we might pause for a moment, here in the quiet, and let the threads of these lives settle. They were never meant to be remembered, these people. Not in history books, not in paintings, not even in stories told aloud. Their work was too strange, too filthy, too uncomfortable. But without them, the world would not have functioned. Not the sacred rituals of death, not the science of medicine, not the cleanliness of the city, nor the constant, grinding survival of the poor. These quiet figures formed the scaffolding beneath the surface of respectable life. We often like to imagine history as the story of great men and famous deeds, but much of human life has been built by hands no one watched too closely. These sin eaters, resurrection men, gong farmers, and mudlarks moved at the edges, between life and death, between filth and cleanliness, between society's gaze and its blind spots. They absorbed what others could not bear to carry. They handled what others feared to touch. They looked where others refused to look. And in doing so, they offered something strangely noble, a kind of invisible service. Not one clothed in honor or reward, but in necessity, sacrifice, and the quiet endurance that makes societies possible. We might not know their names. We might only glimpse their stories in old parish records, police reports, or footnotes. But their lives speak to something very human, that survival and even dignity often begin in the margins. That some of the most extraordinary lives are those no one thought to call extraordinary. So, wherever you are tonight tucked safely beneath warm covers, the hum of the modern world quieted just for now, perhaps carry with you a small memory of these forgotten professions. These lonely lives lived in service to others in ways too humble, too peculiar, or too unsettling to be celebrated. History forgets. But here, in this quiet hour, we remember. Sleep well.